Okay, well, now that we've have a plan and we're executing our risk management plan by identifying our risks, and there could be many of them, now that we've applied probabilities and impacts and done our qualitative and quantitative analysis on them so that we know which ones are the most advantageous to us, or conversely the ones that are most egregious to us, now we start to put a plan against them to capitalize upon them happening or to mitigate them when they do occur. So let's look at those. Okay, here we have, to remind you again what we're dealing with, to frame this, project risk is about maximizing the likelihood and impact of positive events or opportunities and minimizing the likelihood and impact of negative events, which are threats. So we've done 11.5 down there. We've looked at that. We're about to look at that 11.5, and then we'll also look at 11.6, control risks. So here's the ETO diagram for planning risk responses. Inputs, major inputs, of course the management plan is our guide, but here our major input here is the risk register itself. That is the list of identified risks, root causes of risks if we have that, and then our risk watch list, which is the very, very low priority risks at this point in time anyway. We also have in there potential responses. When we first identify the risk, we may have brainstorms about, well, if this does happen, we think we ought to do something like this about it. Not much detail, but at least you have a thought of how you're going to approach it. That's called your potential responses. And then you would prioritize your risks too because of your risk ratings and so on that you've done during qualitative or even quantitative if you do that. Remember, that's an option to you if it's a benefit based on your project and your organization. The outputs are very specific documents like the project management plan would be updated possibly. Basically your schedule, cost, quantity, procurement, HR, a number of plans could be impacted because of risk and the way you're going to use that information to plan your responses. Your baselines also, scope, schedule, cost, your triple constraint may very well be of very deep value to you as you're doing your responses, because whatever your responses are going to impact something because it's out of the ordinary. Project documents, of course, your risk register might be updated and its companion assumptions log. There may be change requests that we're going to use as outputs to make adjustments or preventative actions or whatever we might need. Technical documents may be updated because risk may affect those. Whatever it is part of our, will be output as a project document. Tools and techniques we use, these are strategies. As it says here, strategies for positive risks, responses, strategies for responding to negative risks, and then we'll talk about the contingent response strategies. We'll clarify what those are, and of course expert judgment we always can rely on. So, inputs. Well, a little more on this. Process and benefits to the project objectives, which are basically your scope, time, cost, quality. Develop options and actions to enhance opportunities. Hopefully they'll happen because they're opportunities, they're a benefit to us. Reduce threats and then respond to those threats that are called accepted threats, which we'll see. That's part of all this. We address all risks by priority is the best way to do it. Obviously, how else would you really want to approach risk other than the priorities you feel that they will impact your project. And resources and activities, you need to include risk management activities that you're doing here in your budget and in your schedule and in your plans. Don't overlook that. You're doing things, you're doing this quantitative stuff, whatever you're identifying risk, that's all time and money that you're investing in the project. That's got to be in your budget too. You don't do that for free. Okay, now here's our data flow diagram. Here's our topic of discussion, 11.5, activity, process, risk management plan in, risk register in, that's it. Of course, the risk register is what we're really looking at here in detail. If you have in your hand the first printing of the 5th edition, you will notice that this arrow is backwards in your document. The arrow is not an input, the project documents are an output here. So if you have the second printing or better, it'll be corrected, but mark your document if you have the first printing, otherwise it certainly wouldn't make much sense. And by the way, if you do have the first printing, you can go to the PMI website and just put in their search box first printing errata, and you'll get the errata document and make your corrections. So the risk management plan come in. It's our how-to. It again shows roles and responsibilities, who does what in the risk environment on your project. It can indicate risk thresholds. Remember the box of the thresholds, low, medium, high, that scenario, so that you can apply it when you do other things. Definitions of risk analysis. They can define all these things that are appropriate for your project. This is tailoring these processes. Remember earlier I said you can tweak the processes a bit so they fit your project better, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes you may not even do a process. And a good example is your quantitative analysis, where even PMBOK says it's optional depending on what the needs of your project. So there's one where you would tailor it out if you don't need it. The risk register comes in, of course. It has your risks, hopefully root causes, The watch list is there. Potential risk, remember at the beginning it's potential responses. Now we're going to do the real responses, but you have potential to come in, priorities of your risks, and you can also, it should also include symptoms and warning signs. We didn't talk about this earlier, but also the risk register can have, if you identify a risk, well, what's the symptom of this becoming real, so that you can like, oh, this kind of symptom is happening, maybe it's this risk, you can watch it closer, or warning signs, symptoms and warning signs to help you get a jump. If you can get a jump on these things and not have to execute your risk response plan, you're better off, because that is a disruption in your project. You don't want that to happen. So if you can get a jump by watching the symptoms, the warning signs, you may be able to fend it off before it happens. Now there's a number of strategies for identified, which means listed in your risk register, strategies for handling and preparing risk responses for identified risks. Now for both negative and positive risks. PMBOK says the best practice is to apply these strategies here first. So what do? For each risk, you either avoid the risk, you transfer the risk to somebody else. You still own the risk. So if you transfer the risk and who you transfer it to doesn't do a good job with the risk, it still affects you and you still own it and they're accountable for it, but you can transfer the responsibility to some other entity, to some other person, so they're responsible for watching this on your behalf. You can mitigate the risk, which means try to do things in your environment that would reduce the effect of it should it happen. And you can just say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We know it's there. If it happens, it happens. You accept the risk. And this is where you generally would apply a risk response. Because you say, I accept it. It may happen. I don't know what to do about it. Really, how to avoid it, that is. But if it happens, here's a plan that we're going to do if it happens. So avoid, just make it go away for good. How do you do that? Well, this may be something like you have a piece of the pie you're building, and it's so high risk, you convince your stakeholder, if this doesn't work, this whole thing is trash. So why don't we re-engineer this a little bit to take this whole piece out, and we can build something else as a substitute that's not as risky. So if that was the case and the stakeholder approved it, of course you'd have to change your scope baseline and maybe your cost and schedule too. But at least what you've done is you made that particular risk go away for good. It's just not there. It's gone. Transfer the risk. Change the PM plan, well, okay, avoid, change the plan to eliminate it entirely, and it may even be cancel the entire project. If it's that high a risk that you don't want to take, if your stakeholders are really that risk adverse, and as you're into the project, if this risk becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and more likely, and if it were to happen, it would be just a total disaster. You say, well, forget it, cancel the project, may happen. Okay, transfer the risk, but not eliminate it. Shift the threat to a third party and the response to a third party. If it happens, they deal with it. It doesn't relieve you from its management and its responsibility. It's best with financial risk, for example, in insurance, performance bonds, warranties. You could, there's risks there, so you could transfer it to a third party, have them handle it. If it happens, they pay the insurance bill, things like that. But the concept is transfer it to somebody else, have them management under your overall management. You can, if you're in a purchasing environment, you can transfer the cost of the risk to the buyer by having a certain type of contract. And there are many different types of purchasing contracts that are available to you depending on your needs and your project. And one of them is a cost plus contract. We'll look at all these during procurement management knowledge area. So we're not going to go into detail, but a cost plus contract is good to transfer the cost of the risk to a buyer. And similarly, you can transfer the risk to a seller over there with a fixed price contract. So in case pricing is a risk, you can have a fixed price where you pay $5 no matter if it costs your seller $5 or $500, you still pay $5. So the risk is transferred because of that. Mitigate, that's just reduce the probability of an occurrence, reduce the probability and the impact within certain thresholds. It's less costly when you plan this early. Get all the risk out of things you can early. Remember that the curve we had, risk and time and cost, you want to get it right away so it doesn't cost you 5 times as much later to fix it. And you look at all the risk linkages that you have. Finally, accept, deal with it. No change in the project management plan. You say, if it occurs, it occurs. You can have passive acceptance and active acceptance. No action with passive. With active acceptance, you have your contingency reserve to deal with it. Otherwise, you don't do anything until it actually happens, and this is the most common tactic. We're going to review this right here in a few minutes, and then we're going to look at the other strategies. Okay, before we go on, let's one more time review this aspect of negative risk strategies. And again, PMBOK suggests that you assign each risk, either you assign it an avoid, a transfer, mitigate, or an accept early on, and then you can deal with it ongoing. But accept is a kind of a special case. This will be for a risk where I just can't avoid it if it happens. There's no way we can not make it happen should it want to happen. Transfer, nobody wants to accept liability and help us, so it's still ours. We can't transfer it. We can't really do anything to mitigate it. If it happens, therefore it happens. So we accept the risk. Now, no change to your plan. You said, we're moving on with our plan, and if it happens, you can either have passive acceptance, which means you don't do anything until it occurs. You're doing your project, this risk happens, say, oh, there we go, it happens. Or you can have active acceptance, where you plan ahead for it to happen. And that's where you get your contingency reserve, a little money in there so that you can spend that money to fix it when it does happen, should it happen. Otherwise, you don't do anything until it occurs. And this is the most basic, common tactic that project managers use to deal with certain risks. They just accept it. If they can't do the other three, they accept it and say, money aside, we'll deal with that money, use that if it were to happen. So that's negative risk strategies. Positive risk strategies, or opportunities, have very similar but not the same kind of things. You can exploit, because you want a positive risk, you want these opportunities actually to occur because they have benefit to you. And kind of the risk is that they won't occur because you'd like them to occur. So you can exploit them, which means remove all the uncertainty in them so that they will happen. Okay, actions to ensure upside risk is realized. You can do those kind of things. One of them might be this example I mentioned about a new assembly line in a plant with a big piece of equipment you have being built. Whereas when the assembly is finished, if they do the new assembly line on their schedule and it's on time, you can shift your work into there and get it earlier. Okay, that's an upside risk. You want to talk to them, encourage them, maybe whatever it is to try and make sure this thing is moving along so that you can take advantage of this. You can enhance positive risks by increasing the probability that it will happen, which is different than exploit, where you remove uncertainty. You're trying to remove uncertainty, but now you're trying to make sure, under enhance, you just make sure that there's a bigger and bigger probability that it'll happen by whatever action you can take. You can, there it is, maximize the key drivers of that risk, and you maybe even add resources to finish something early, enhancing, increasing the probability of it happening. Share the risk, the opportunity. You can leverage other groups and dynamics to help you. You're not alone in this. Have other people help you, depending on the context of your opportunity risk, to help it make it occur. Allocate opportunity ownership to a third-party structure so they can be working on this risk, making it happen. Now, all participants would share in the benefits of that occurrence. Joint ventures is one example of that, where the joint people get together and they make things happen, risky stuff happen to their advantage. Now, here's the one that is in common: accept your willing acceptance of a positive risk if it happens, which you would want it to be. You don't actively pursue this. You just let it lie, but if it happens, good. Take advantage of it should it happen without enhancing it or exploiting it or sharing it. So that's your positive and negative risk strategies. And you will certainly be quizzed on one or more of these things in a PMP exam. So you need to understand the differences and what their intent. Okay, now we come to contingent response strategies, different than the 8 strategies we just looked at. These are pre-specified conditions that we put in place that activate a plan. If this happens, we put plan B in effect. Okay, there are triggers. There are triggers, pre-specified conditions that activate a plan response, and they're called first. There's 2 levels of this. A risk happens. Let's say a risk. There may be a union strike, and now you don't get your supplies. Okay, the first thing you do, your contingent plan that you would have in place, your response plan is in place if this happens, and the trigger would be, geez, I just heard on the radio this morning, the plant went on strike. Now our production of our goods is stopped. Okay, well, we have a contingency plan, and that is to move this to another supplier. Take what we got or just rebuild it somewhere else. That would be a contingency plan. You also have a fallback plan. That you activate your fallback plan if in fact your contingency plan fails. Let's say you can't get your goods out of the factory because of the picket line. Okay, now your fallback is to just start from scratch with company C. Okay, that's your fallback plan. Now let's say company C says, we're the only ones in the country that can make this other than company A. They're on strike. We're booked to the hilt. It's going to cost you 8 times as much if you want to get priority on us. And of course you say, oh, I can't afford that. So now neither your contingency plan nor your fallback plan has worked. So now you're into the third condition called a workaround. You have to figure out some way to work around it, either change your scope, come up with the $8 million you need if it's that important, or maybe it's just so egregious you just cancel the project. I mean, workaround means you try then to do something, even if it's at the you just trash your schedule and all your baseline, you got to like start over. At least there's a workaround there. I mean, that's an extreme example perhaps, but that illustrates the difference between contingency fallback and a workaround. So you need to know those three things in case they would occur. And of course, there's lower levels of egregiousy there. It could be much less worse than I described in that scenario. But those are the tactics that you have available for you to mitigate, not mitigate, but to respond to a risk that you have accepted. I know this may occur, and now you have a plan in place, actually 3 plans. The contingent plan, your first line of attack, then a fallback if that doesn't work, and if that fails, then some kind of workaround, which actually might lead to cancellation. So those are your options. So workarounds, a response to a threat that has occurred, for which a prior response has not been planned, passive acceptance, or known unknown, or was not effective, a fallback plan. And for any risk, you can create these that you feel you need to create these response plans for. The other ones, you just accept, passive, you let it lie, and if it happens, then you deal with it at that point in time. Of course, expert judgment comes into bear here too, to help you identify which risks you really could use contingent fallback plans for. And the outputs of planning risk responses are your PM plan would update, possibly, if you have to actually change, your baselines, cost schedule, baselines, scope baselines, quality, procurement, human resources, all the subsidiary plans may change too. Project documents, again, here's another example where they say project documents, but they're really referring specifically, mostly to the risk register. Again, remember, but not limited to, there may be other documents like your assumptions log, or even other things outside of risk may be updated because of risk responses. So again, the risk register, owners, responsibilities, the agreed risk response strategies. For any risk, are you going to accept it, exploit it, share it, mitigate it, avoid it, whatever it is. Each risk has to have that, whether it's positive or negative risk. You have to have your contingency reserve in place when it's appropriate for the risks that you have accepted and you have a plan in place for, so you can fund them to do that plan. It's like a little mini project plan, right? So you got to fund it and the whole bit. Your contingent response and the activation triggers of what, at some point, it's like a disaster response plan for a company. There's an earthquake or there's something and things aren't right in the company. Do you go in and try to fix things and let people in, or do you have to actually activate your disaster recovery plan, which is incredibly expensive if you have to go off-site to a new facility, gear it up, and operate there until your building is either repaired or rebuilt? That's a difficult decision to make. Even if it's obvious, it's difficult to say, okay, I'm triggering my disaster recovery plan. Boy, you're committing millions of dollars perhaps with that one phone call. So even on a smaller scale with risks on your project, at some point you may have to say, that's the trigger, activate this response plan. So it's up to you, the project manager, to make that decision. And like any kind of activity or risks we deal with, once you deal with a risk and you fix it, which was not really intended to be done at all during the project, that's why risk, and now it's realized, you're going to have possibly secondary risks, which are new risks that come to light as a fallout as a result of you activating your response plan. Because your response plan, you may not pay a lot of attention to make sure everything is right all over, because it's an emergency situation, basically. So there are fallout problems, and now you have more risks that you have to identify and deal with in a similar manner after the smoke clears. That's called secondary risk. And one last thing here, residual risk. You need to know the definition of this. Residual risks are risks that are expected to remain after a planned response has been taken, as well as those that have been deliberately accepted. So you're going to have your risk register. You can have a number of risks that are accepted. I accept these risks. When they happen, they happen. I either have a plan or I don't. So those risks plus these secondary risks are the total residual risks of your project. So you need to know that concept and that definition. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about controlling these risks and these plans in our project that we have. So we'll be back in a minute. Okay, now we're in the last process of project risk management, which is control risks. So now that we've identified a risk, we've assessed them, prioritized them, we know how good or bad they may be for our company, our project, or our company, and we have created our response plans for them. And now we need to control those risks and plans should they occur. That's what control risk is all about. So down here we see what it's all about again, implementing the response plan, making that call, say implement plan B for risk 8.3.9. Okay, and you track all your risks like that. You monitor the residual risk once your response is over with. Again, residual risks are new risks that emerge because of what you did to respond to a risk, and maybe identify the new risk there. And then you evaluate the risk response effectiveness. How effective was your plan, your response plan, to mitigate and resolve that risk when it occurred? And you're continuously looking to optimize your risk responses. Keep them up to date. Just because you have a risk plan doesn't mean that's it forever, because the risk itself that would trigger that response plan, the risk itself may morph into something better or worse. So you always got to keep on track of these risks, which is one good reason that on a project that really recognizes the value of monitoring their risks and doing these activities is you need a person on your staff, your administrative staff, and hopefully you're at least a strong matrixed organization where you do have a dedicated administrative staff. Remember that from way back, chapter 2 and 3. Those people continuously look at these risks, keep them fresh and updated, and they are your lifeline that could save your project. So controlling risks. The basic stuff here, the project management plan and all its subsidiary plans come to play here. Your risk register, of course, is your main document. Work performance data and reports are important. Why do you think that might be? Because work performance data might be that aspect of risk control where you see things coming. Okay, you see possibilities of risks coming, they're emerging. So this data will give you some ideas about, well, watch this, maybe this risk over here, maybe actually happening, because watch what's happening with the data day to day. Okay, great source. And of course, reports themselves are just the more condensed, aggregated summary reports of whatever, but they give you clues too as to what might be coming. Assessing, auditing, analyzing, and measuring your risk responses. You generate work performance information. Once you activate a plan and you're done with it, you report it out as information. And of course, change requests certainly could be an outcome of the fallout from activating a response plan. So, control risks, like it says down here, it's really all about project integration, because project integration, its main focus is to do what? It's to manage change. Don't want change to happen. But if you activate a response plan, change is going to happen. So it's all part of project integration and managing that well. So here's our data flow diagram. PM plan comes in, work performance reports come in, and data come in, all help you, do the crystal ball thing. Well, we may have to activate a response if this kind of data continues to come in. Of course, by then you're going to go down to your work staff and try to mitigate it there and get them back on track. But if that's not possible, you may have to activate a plan. And your outputs are change requests, go where? Only one place, 4.5, perform integrated change control. Work performance information that you would aggregate and send out to the appropriate parties according to your communication plan, and your stakeholder management plan goes into monitor and control work. That's where you do the work. It goes in there. Well, that's not where you do the work. That's where you monitor and control the work based on the work that was done in 4.3, which is on here somewhere. Here it is over here. 4.3, that's where your data comes in, so your information comes out and goes over there. And organizational process assets are updated, so we'll see that. So the PM plan, in particular, they're referring to your risk management plan, subsidiary plan, which is the guidance on how you do these things. Risk register has your owners of the risk. Every owner, if I hadn't say this, every risk has to have an owner. They're the ones that are responsible for that plan, for identifying the triggers and for making the call to you, unless you give them the authority to pull the trigger and activate the plan. But you have to have an owner for each and every risk. And you have your established risk responses now for the risks that you select to have a plan for. It will include then the response effectiveness assessment, which means once you activate the plan, how effective was it, that plan, to solve the problem. Of course, secondary risks now may come into play, and they are added, to your risk register like any other risk. And you still have, and some of them may end up on the watch list, the low priority, but that's still part of the risk register. So work performance data, risk impacted performance, results, deliverable status, schedule progress, costs incurred. Things are getting out of whack, risk is kind of risky. You may have some kind of response if some particular risk affects these egregiously. Work performance reports are things now at a higher level where they aggregate stuff to show you variance analysis, earned value data that we'll get into when we talk about cost, which relates specifically to forecasting data. So all this kind of data, forecasting and a risk. You may have a simple risk that says, the probability of us getting out of cost control, is moderate. And your forecast will show that, if this is your baseline, you have a tolerance, and if this is your baseline, you're approaching it, you may say, well, we may have to trigger our response to bring this back under control. So you can see these things coming, and that's really what you want before you have to activate a plan. You want to make corrective actions before a more severe kind of plan has to be put into place. And risk reassessment. This gets into progressive elaboration again and continuous monitoring of your risks, because they change daily maybe, you never know. So risk reassessment is a tool and technique you have. Here's where you, again, continuously, because we're in controlling risks now, we're under the monitoring and controlling process group. By the way, notice again, there is no executing process here in risk. You don't execute a risk. You monitor and control, and you execute your response plan under this monitor and control. So you control risk by executing your response plan. And like then to reassess, new risk, this is your continuous performance improvement thing. Identify new risk, reassess the current risk, because again, they may get worse, they may get better, they may go away, and then close risks if in fact a particular risk just is no longer viable. Kind of an odd example maybe, but if you have something in a plant and you're afraid the plant may close, but you have a response plan to move it somewhere else, and now the plant does close, well, that response plan and that risk for that company is now gone because there is no more company. So that's how you would get rid of a risk, as one example of that kind of thing. Risk audits. You need to audit your risks. There's techniques to do that. The technique would be examine the risk responsive effectiveness. Again, audit it. Hopefully identify the risks. Well, you already know the risk that caused the plan to be activated. So you want to find out, well, what is the real root cause of why that happened? Now try to always get to the root cause, because that may mitigate a bunch of other risks. Risk audits, again, are performed routinely, continuous process improvement, and you need to decide the format and the objectives of your audits before you actually do them. Have your own little plan in place so that you just don't jump around like crazy, but you have a reason and a purpose and some consistency in your reassessment. Variance and trend analyses is another tool and technique. Again, we're talking about forecasting and things like this, trending. Here's where you would compare your plan versus your actual performance, and you would, prepare work performance data and reports and stuff like that relative to what's happening with risk affecting your plan and actual performance. Detecting trends, baseline deviations, like I was showing you over here, your cost goes up. It may indicate that there are risks at work in there. What are they? Are they new risks, where we go back into risk reassessment, add new risk, or is it this risk changing? What do you want to do? You can forecast potential deviations, for time and cost targets, like we just said. And earned value analysis, again, that's where we do some serious forecasting of our costs over time. You can use those to monitor overall project performance, trending. And then again, risks may apply to that. Technical performance measurement. Compare the technical work during project execution to technical achievement schedule. Now, here's your technical work, here's your achievement schedule. Are you making it? Technical performance, if you're not making it, there's risks there. Risk can come from anywhere, so don't overlook anything. Technical performance measurement, it requires a definition of the objective of your technical performance. You need quantifiable measures to measure things. Obviously, you have to measure them from some basis. You've got to have those. Could be weights, transaction times, number of defects, storage capacity, anything that helps you identify technical aspects and to identify risks to it. Helps you then forecast the degree of being able to achieve your project scope. For example, maybe at a milestone level, you reassess when you do milestones and you do your trending and how am I doing. What's the risk at this point? Reserve analysis. Okay, here we're talking about your contingency and even your management reserves. You want to review the adequacy of your current profile of your contingency reserves that you have in your official project budget. Contingency reserves are part of your official project budget. Management reserves are for those things you don't know what's going to happen. If you do, you'd like to have some money to fix them, but you never planned on it. So that's a management reserve. It's outside of the project budget. And that's where I said that's a risk in itself, because that may go away. Say, well, you don't need this. You still have your project, but you don't have this money now. Compare the remaining contingency reserves to the amount of risk remaining. So if you use some of that contingency reserve to actually respond to a risk where a plan has been activated, you've used some of that money, it's reduced. Now you've got to make sure that what's left is still adequate for the risks that are still remaining, because there may be more risks remaining, secondary risk or even new risks during reassessment, where now you may need to get more money, ask for more money, draw it out of the management reserve, put it in your contingency, or just say go back and ask for more funding altogether. Meetings during control risk, this is where a good place to review all risks. Everybody gets all your heads together, all your experts. Here's where we are in risk, how are we doing, what do you think, should we reassess, whatever it is. Frequent discussion helps you reveal more risks. And of course, then you need to apply your initial strategies to them. Your avoid, mitigate, transfer, accept, exploit, enhance, all that. And it may reveal them more opportunities to exploit, enhance, share, and accept. So meetings are good just to sit down. If you're regular at this, have regular meetings to this, you'll all be in tune, you'll know what you want to do, you'll act as a group, you get synergy, and your risk management will be incredibly more valuable to you and the project and the company. So here's outputs, a number of them we want to talk about. We'll talk about these in a minute. Okay, so here are the outputs from the control risk process. Work information is output by you. And what does that consist of? It's work performance data that came in. You're going to analyze it in the context of controlling risk. You're going to aggregate it and make some sense out of it. There may be some actionable things you need to do because of it, and that's what the information is for, actionable stuff. Risk analysis results from executing your risk response plan can then be aggregated into information that will go back into integrated change management and then finally published as reports if appropriate, or otherwise just general project communications. And the information is used to communicate and support just general project decision making, because this happened, now what are you going to do, that kind of thing. Change requests are a natural output of control risks, because now you've executed a response plan. So now, because that happened, maybe you now need to make some corrective actions to your project. You may need to realign now project performance with the PM plan because this risk just decimated some process, and now there's no way you can meet one of your baselines. You need to re-baseline perhaps. But your contingency plans and your workarounds, and again, contingencies are for specific events that happen when you have active, not passive, but active involvement with an accepted risk. And workarounds are responses that are not previously planned for, passive, or if your contingency and fallback don't work, you're going to use workarounds. So you may have change requests to adjust all these plans should that risk happen again. Just because a risk happens and you compensated for it with a plan doesn't mean that risk won't happen again. And that's part of your reassessment that we just saw, is to determine, well, is it like the plant closed and now the risk is gone? Or, boy, this happened and it could happen again. So maybe you need to adjust your plans to compensate for that better. So that would be a corrective action change request. Now, preventative actions is bring future performance back in line with the PM plan. That's really what you want to try to do all the time rather than really make corrective actions or re-baseline things, rather. If you can issue, and you're doing this with a change request because that's an official document that has to be acted upon and closed. That's why you use a change request rather than just a directive or a memo to somebody, go fix, watch out for this, correct it. You need to have it officially documented so it can be closed. It says, yes, I did that action. So preventative action is not to change your PM plan, but it's to prevent you from having to change your PM plan or your baseline, rather. So that's what that's for, to bring stuff back in line. Remember I said before, here's your baseline, you're going along with your project schedule, and your schedule is out of whack now with your baseline. At some point, if it gets so bad you can't bring it back, you got to re-baseline it. But what you want to try to do is do preventative actions to prevent this from happening, and maybe some corrective stuff to bring it back into baseline is where you want to be, if possible. That would actually provide for a happier client, because customer satisfaction is a component of project success. And of course, there's a third type of change request. There's maybe 5, remember. Maybe 5, and in fact there actually are 5, even though 1 and 2 of them, the updates and the enhancements, are very rarely used according to PMBOK. But of those 5, defect repair is the third most likely one to be used, and that is to modify a non-conforming deliverable or a component of a deliverable or whatever. So you may issue defect change repairs because that risk that occurred that you applied the response to has broken something, and you need to fix it. So defect repair. Here, just so you remember, there is a 4th and 5th type called enhancements and updates. Outputs are, again, your PM plan may be updated because of all this. Your approved risk change requests, again, may require an update to some of your plans, your subsidiary plans. And project documents, most obviously, are your risk register, will be updated for sure if you activate a risk response plan, because the results, a little history of how this response rolled out in your company, in your project, how you did it, and the results of it are part of the risk register. Maybe not the main grid, as we saw, that listed the stakeholders and their ranking of influence and power and how we want them to change it from a neutral to a leader. That is your main risk register. But attached as an appendix, say, you would have documents for all of your risks, plans that you have activated, and a little scenario about what happened and what the result was, what the secondary risks are, and all that stuff. So it goes in the risk register. So it's the results. The risk register keeps all of your risk reassessments, new, old, coming off, coming on, audits you make of that as you keep it fresh, and risk reviews, and the actual results Actual risk manifestations and risk responses. And when it says actual risk manifestations, how did the risk manifest itself so that you finally decided to pull the trigger to activate the risk response plan? That's what that is. It's all in the risk register project document. Your OPAs, future project support will need templates, risk breakdown structures, lessons learned from your project, and those will be updated as necessary because of what you learned from your experience in executing risk response plans. So notice there are no environmental factors at play here. Obviously, again, remember there's only two places you update your EEFs, and that's under human resource management, so they're not here anyway. So good. So that is it for project risk management. So if you haven't addressed risk, or if you have, hopefully this will help clarify some things, give you some new ideas, or at least instill in you the critical importance of addressing risk on your project, no matter how small it is. And certainly if it's larger, you absolutely have to address risk, because you'll be in a dire strait if certain risks happen on especially a larger project and you haven't even planned for it. You don't know what to do. You won't look well in your management's eyes and certainly in your stakeholder and sponsor's eyes. Why didn't you plan for this? You should do this. So good. So we're going to come back next module with planning quality management. We're going to start talking about quality now, which is a natural progression from what we've done so far. We've got a team together. We know how to communicate. We've got a risk plan in place. So and scope. So let's do this. Quality next time.